So the situation is that Europe will become the slave of the US in order to go in war with Russia. And let's say it this way, I think that's the same, these are the same think tanks which work also in Asia. So if they can use Taiwan and Philippines and other nations as a representative for the war with China. So and the United States, they need the resources, they need the commodities. And the problem is China has already a lot of commodities in China, within China by itself, and they are also controlling a lot of commodities in Africa. And in the same is also with Russia. There were 13 regions in Africa which were controlled by France, and now, step by step, the France will lose control over these countries. And Burkina Faso, for example, turns by itself to Russia. So, United States needs the commodities, so they need to become friends with Russia and China in order to get what they need. But on the other hand, I suppose, by their allies, they are also preparing for a potential war with these countries at the same time. And in my opinion, everything is connected to the Agenda 2030. Also, Trump is one, I suppose, who is going to fulfill this Agenda 2030. And China and Russia, because China is a communist state and Russia was a communist state, the control level of the population is much higher in these countries than in Europe or in Western countries. And this control will come to Europe and also USA, and especially in the United States, the countries will less led by the government, but more by corporations. So it will become an oligarchic, technocratic country. What do you think about that?
Due to the bad internet connection, I caught most of what you said, but there were moments where it froze and came in and out. But I think I got everything important, like the core idea that you were expressing as a concern.
Okay.
I'm not as I'm not taking as cynical of an approach necessarily on all fronts that you outlined, in the sense that right now most of the Agenda 2030 is definitely the dominant goal. That's for sure, to bring about what came out of Maurice Strong's and the Stephen Rockefeller and Gorbachev's development of the Earth Charter in 1993, and the Agenda 21 operation that was part of the Earth Charter program to supersede nation states under this idea that we need to get rid of sovereignty in order for a new global eco paradigm to impose itself from a one world government above nations. I'm totally on board. I agree that is the overarching ambition of the followers of Maurice Strong, or the heirs of Maurice Strong and company, that are very powerful. Maurice Strong, I mean, himself was an asset of the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers are a minor dynasty within the empire's hierarchy. So it's important to keep in mind, when I say from heirs of or followers of Maurice Strong, I'm speaking about it from an understanding of the nested nature of the managerial architecture of the empire. Okay, I'm not trying to say that Maurice Strong is the cause of our problems or anything. Just like I wouldn't say Kissinger is the cause of our problems, right? These people are groomed. They have certain sociopathic tendencies, a certain worldview that they embrace religiously, and they're rewarded for their competency and their devotion to that system of oligarchy, that they then rise to become the public face or the enforcer of the policy that isn't their own. They're just instruments of the will of a higher power, and that higher power smells like sulfur. So when I look at Russia, China especially right now, and I've done a lot. I've published a number of books going through the mapping of the Chinese deep state, where it comes from, what its current configuration is. I did this exercise just to help my mind out for Canada with my book series on the untold history of Canada. Like, where are the legitimate movements and representatives of something human in the Canadian history? And then I did the same exercise over a few years for the American. It's called the Clash of the Two Americas that we've talked about, right? To try to just map out where is the legitimate human representative movement of the United States from its beginnings to the present, and where is this evil thing that has co-opted it and killed its great presidents over time and made things bad. So I've tried something similar. It's still a work in progress, but I've done a fair bit of work on the Russian and the Chinese deep states and their history, their evolution, who seeded them, who represents them at different moments. From what I gather is that beyond the word Communist Party of China, there's a much more powerful, older, but more subtle tradition embodied in Renaissance Confucianism, which has been something which the oligarchy has been trying to destroy for a very long time, which supersedes the momentary, the Red Dynasty period that was sparked with Mao Zedong and the victory over Chiang Kai-shek. Now, within the content, because you have Kairos and Chronos, right? And so in terms of the time of God of Kairos, you have this more principled idea of a more unbroken continuity of principle of good and evil manifesting, in such a way that I could say that things that were happening in Han China 2,000 years ago are just as applicable to what's happening today, 2,000 years later, right? As far as the battles between good and evil, there's certain common principles that pertain to the nature of man and God, and yeah, no, we were just talking about. I was just going through my idea of why China is not really communist in that sense. They have communist mechanical aspects to it, but they also have like a robust, entrepreneurial society. They're registering more intellectual patents than the United States at this point. They're all of those attributes you would qualify as being a successful capitalist society are being met by their benchmarks as far as developing both. I mean, the difference is that they don't split the nation state from the private sector. They keep the private sector under the influence of the nation state, whereas in the West, we've allowed the private banking class to take control over the nation state under the Bilderbergs and other things, which Maurice Strong was a steering committee member. So I see that there's like a fight to try to co-opt or influence what the terms of the new system are going to be, and we're gonna have a new system. So when you look at the very ambiguous language of like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you'll hear the Chinese, the Russians, Angela Merkel and Mertz and US assholes around Biden all saying nice things about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is like a list of 17 things. But they mean very different things, because they'll say like end poverty, water for everybody, healthcare access for everybody. Okay, fine. Like, no one's not going to agree to those things. But then where one side is just using the flowery language, but actually has an Orwellian set of opposite meanings, like, water for those who can afford the water or who have the right social credit scores to access their water, rations for the week. That's like a very dishonest, silent intention. Whereas when I look at what China's been doing with their allies, they're actually building massive water projects and making it abundantly available for everybody. And they're building the Great Man-Made Water Project, which is greening deserts, and it's doing all of these things. So I think they're fighting over control over what the definitions of the UN mean. What is the definitions of the sustainable? What does sustainable mean? Does sustainable mean stasis or degrowth, or does it mean sustained development? Which is when I look at how the language is being used in the context of the Chinese intelligentsia, it's usually geared towards sustained development, always going to the next platform of progress. So there's a fight over what is, do we go for depopulation under this idea of global regulations, global, what is this idea of this governing architecture for the world? Is it going to be premised around divide to conquer, depopulation for an elite, or is it going to be based upon the idea of empowering individuals and different nation states and societies to participate in solving problems for their future? And that's where I see the battle lines currently. And so I don't see everybody in on it in the way that you were alluding to in your question, if you know what I'm saying.